That was incredible. And I am so humbled to have our next guest here with us. As you know, we're living in a time of moral decay. It's a time where fake news gets more attention than facts. Celebrity culture rules, and a president can be elected who openly lies and assaults women. In your states, you have forces who push through laws that make women second-class citizens, rip health care away from those who desperately need it, devalue communities because of the color of their skin, and further marginalize the poor and oppressed. In these times, before it's too late, we have to push back on these forces and rediscover our moral footing. And there's no one better in the world to lead us there than our next speaker, Reverend William Barber. A few years ago, when North Carolina found itself in the control of conservative ideologues that were pushing through draconian pieces of public policy, Reverend Barber organized the Moral Monday movement to organize communities fight back. That movement, I believe, is responsible for some of the good news this election that came out of North Carolina, including yesterday's news of Governor Pat McCrory stepping aside. It's time to further expand this movement and organize ourselves to fight back in your states by finding the moral high ground and holding accountable those that want to take us backwards. Please join me in welcoming the man who will lead us there, Reverend William Barber.
Forward together. I heard somebody that knows our chant from North Carolina. It goes like this, say forward together. That's it, forward together, not one step back. Thank you, my brother, for having me here today. And we're just coming in last night from New York, where Democracy Now! Was having its 20th anniversary and meeting with people across the country. I know that the time is some of you have to leave, and I could speak to so many of my friends from North Carolina to Mississippi to Connecticut. So I want to move right into, hey, Tennessee, I want to move, see, you're going to start something now. So what up, y'all? That's how I'm going to start this. How y'all doing? That covers everybody. There is a scripture in the Bible that has weighed heavily on me ever since the election this year. It's found in the book of Samuel, and all of you need to read it, because it was a time when a public official felt rejected. Samuel, the people, he had led people. He was the bridge between a judge named Samson and a king named Saul that would lead to a king named David. And Samson really cared about the people, like a lot of you. He really cared. In fact, his name meant asked of God. His mama had asked God for him. And he really became a prophet reluctantly. He became and prophets then were public servants, but he was reluctantly one. But he tried to do the right thing. And then there came a day that the people looked around at Brexit, other nations. They looked around at other nations and they saw these strong men taking the throne. Samuel was strong, but he wasn't like them because he had compassion. And the people who had a legacy of freedom and justice and God helping them and bringing them up out of Egypt came to Samuel and said, we want to be like other nations. We want that kind of leadership. And Samuel became quite dejected and rejected. And he prayed to God and said, Lord, they've rejected my leadership. And God said to him two things that you and I need to hear today. First of all, he said, no, they didn't. They rejected my leadership. They didn't reject you. They rejected something much deeper than you. Samuel, in other words, what you just saw wasn't even about a normal election. They were rejecting something much deeper. And they will have to learn what they have rejected and in order to repent and come back from it. But then he also said to them, this is normal. That Israel had always had a history in that day, according to the scriptures, of loving God, the God of justice, but then at some point turning their back and going the other way. I want to talk for a little while today, a kind of lecture, instruction, conversation about resiliency and revival after rejection. That's your role now. Some of you won your offices, some of you didn't. But how do you lead the people? How do you lead yourselves to have resiliency and revival after what this election represented in terms of social and political rejection? Because you know, in this election, we saw the rejection of statesmanship and stateswomanship for slick performance. We saw the rejection of real answers for lies and propaganda. We saw the rejection by many of our deepest moral and religious values about justice and love, and instead they chose the heresy of white evangelicalism. Now, I deliberately say heresy. Now, I didn't say theological malpractice. It is heresy when you attempt to use the deep religious values in the service of meanness, hate, racism, and misogyny, and war. And in some ways, this election was a rejection of our deepest moral values by those who claim to go under the title white evangelicalism that my good friend Jim Wallace says is really more about white than evangelicalism, and it is a deeply racist interpretation of theology. We also saw the rejection of objective media for a media circus. And the media is still getting caught up in that circus, because even now they're trying to normalize the abnormal. I was listening to one the other night, and they were saying about the president-elect, just give him a chance. We're not sure if he meant what he said. Well, see, for me, the scriptures say whatever comes out of your mouth reveals what's in your heart. And if you look at the appointees and who a person is surrounding themselves with, we shouldn't be waiting, we should be worrying, we should be analyzing. But the corporate media, that's sometimes more interested in ratings, you know, in this election, they played with somebody a long time. We also have seen the rejection of dealing with racism and the choosing instead of fear and the normalization of bigotry in the political process. And so early Wednesday morning, on November the 9th, after running a campaign that was enthusiastically endorsed even by the KKK, Donald Trump thanked his supporters for victory and promised to be president for all Americans, which means on January, what's that, 21st, January 20th, 2017, we will move from a president who has tried to be compassionate, who's tried to fulfill the Republican dream, well, of Teddy Roosevelt, the moral dream of Teddy Roosevelt to give all people health care, who has tried to lean to the better angels of ourselves. We will move from that to a con artist. And that ought to be a source of political anxiety. It was a shock, they say, to almost every pollster and political pundit. It was a kind of political upheaval. But I want to say something that people may not be saying to you. And that is that the reactionary wave that swept across America on November the 8th is not an anomaly. If you don't grab that, you can't deal with it. This is not an anomaly in our history. This is not the first time we've elected a racist president in America's history. In fact, the majority of the times in our history. Democrats and Republicans. We've either ejected someone who was outright racist in their policies. I ain't talking about waving a Klan flag, I'm talking about in their policies. Or they were so affected by racism that they compromised on the back of black and brown people and thereby hurt even poor white people. This is not an anomaly. Somebody keep this mic up for me a little bit. It is an all too familiar pattern in the long struggle in this experiment called America, and to what is known down through history as the American Reconstruction and the attempt to become a more perfect nation. Anyone who watched the returns on television Tuesday night, you remember that red band that stretched from North Carolina all the way down through the South, across the Midwest, up to the Rust Belt? The former Confederate states, this solid South, and certain Rust Belt areas and certain suburbs, even and outlying areas in the North, became a reliable base for Trumpism, not just Trump. But he joins a long line of white men who have leveraged this base to get to the White House. And if we don't deal with this history, we ultimately cannot address it. One writer, from associate professor of sociology, put it like this: with a snarl, Trump ratifies his supporters' rage. Listen to what she says. She says, for a constituency that feels misunderstood and resentful politically, silenced by critics who deem their views racist, sexist, homophobic, or simply problematic, Trump proffers dignity, voice, and visibility without shame. He said out loud, you can turn down just a little bit, he said out loud things his supporters have been scorned for thinking. And for decades, many have found their validation only in the charismatic conservative talk radio host and cable news analysis. But Trump brought it again mainstream in a way we had not seen since George Wallace or Barry Goldwater. In fact, if you go and find George Wallace's 1968 Madison Square speech in New York, and you lay it on top of Trump's stump speeches, it's pretty much the same speech. Right on down, I've read it, to where he says, get that protester out of there, hit them if you have to, they need to go somewhere. When I become president, we're gonna restore law and order, we're not gonna have this. That's a direct line from Wallace placed in the text of Trump. He stood at the podium and he unapologetically spoke their truth without equivocation. He doubled down on his venom. He said things you and I know, if Obama had said one of those things, he'd have never made it out of the primary. But he doubled down, and the media for a long time took it as just a joke. Kimmel, who's a professor who studies expressed fear, says that what Trump gave voice to was aggrieved entitlement, where persons feel like they have been cheated and they want somebody to be held accountable. But what he did in a very shrewd way is, instead of getting them to shake their fist at global capital, and other real causes of their pain, he pointed their hostilities at women, people of color, Muslims, and recent immigrants, and thereby gave their fear a place to go, their anger a place to be directed, but it was the wrong space. You see, there are economic fears. 400 families in this country, according to Joseph Stiglitz's book, The Price of Inequality, make an average of $97,000 an hour, while we are locking people up for wanting $15 an hour. The 10 poorest country's poorest 12 states are in the South, 10 of them. But they're also red states. They're also the place where people who are poor are electing candidates who are the most adverse to the very program that would help the poor. And so what you have to ask yourself is, in this moment, what is it, since there are 8 million more poor white people than there are black, and there are 5 million more poor white people than there are Latino, and more white people need living wages, need health care, need Affordable Care Act. I was reading an article in the New York Times yesterday, said 2 out of 3 of the people who are going to lose their health care are the ones that voted for Trump. But the question is not just to look down, is that what is it that trumps common sense? And what kind of message and focus do we have to cut through that? He appealed to both racial fear and resentment. And the reality is, like so many things in America's racial history, appealing to racial fear and resentment is not new. If you go back in our history, Southern politicians developed something called the Mississippi Plan in the mid-1800s, when they were upset because state legislatures all over the South were run by either predominantly black bodies or black and white bodies that had come together in something called fusion politics. By 1872, every Southern legislature in the South was controlled by a progressive body. And many of them were predominantly black in the South. And they were passing progressive legislation like public education as a right, wage increase as a right, equal protection as a right, voting right. But by 1872, the former planters were howling against that. They couldn't stand it. And they first attacked the courts, then they attacked voting rights, they attacked public education, they started calling for tax cuts because they wanted to disable the ability of the state government to fulfill the promises, post-Civil War promises to the former sons and daughters of slaves and to the poor whites in the South. A lot of people don't think about that history. And the Klan was formed in 1872 to go after whites first, who dared to work with black people in forging these new constitutions. And then they resented occupation. They resented diversity. This is they resented it. The Tea Party, oh, that's the wrong century. The Redemption Movement, every time now I mix it up because it's so similar. The Redemption Movement resented it. And so they developed something called the Mississippi Plan to make their country great again. Voter suppression, intimidation swept through the South, 1876, but they didn't win. They didn't win the White House. So you have an election in 1877 where a candidate for president loses the popular vote. But a deal is cut and said, we'll give you the Electoral College, because that's what it was designed to do, to make sure that you would never have a diverse coalition of progressives that could ultimately determine who leads this country. That was the goal of the Electoral College. It was rooted in race and class by a wealthy oligarchy that didn't trust black folk nor poor white people. And Rutherford B. Hayes was given the presidency through the Electoral College with a promise that he would remove the federal troops from the South. He became president. They stacked the courts, the Supreme Court, because they wanted to take the country back and make it great again. This was their mantra then. And by 1883, the 1875 Civil Rights Act was reversed. In 1896, you get Plessy versus Ferguson. And the fight for Reconstruction was undermined. And as a part of that Reconstruction movement, they had this religious movement called the Redemption Movement. It sounded religious, but it was irreligious because basically the Redemption Movement was a cover for a race movement using religion. Because the underpinning of the Redemption Movement was the immoral assertion that black and white people working together was sinful. The same kind of backlash followed the legislative victories of the Civil Rights Movement. This, what we're seeing, is not an anomaly. We call it the second Reconstruction: the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, the Poor People's, the War on Poverty, which in fact did work at a time when Democrats were willing to say the word poor and not just those trying to make it into the middle class. And there was a backlash against the second Reconstruction. It wasn't limited to Southern segregationists either. Richard Nixon's Law and Order campaign of 1968 was an intentional effort to win the South and to stop George Wallace by being racist, but not quite as racist as him. Kevin Phillips said, all you have to do if you want to win in America and hold on to the South is figure out who hates who and pit them against each another. So Richard Nixon uses code words. Lee Atwater said, we learned not to use the N-word. We learned not to wave a rebel flag. You use code words like force busing, law and order, entitlement reform, and tax cuts. They called it the Southern strategy. And Nixon won. And we have to know this history. You can't just walk over it. Donald Trump's unanticipated victory could not have been possible, another writer says, without Barack Obama as America's first African-American president. Trump entered politics. He got his stance waging a crusade against the possibility of Obama's citizenship. It proved to be the perfect way to touch the psychic wound of so many Americans who have not faced our legacy of racism. That's why anybody familiar with the Mississippi Plan of 1876 or the Southern Strategy Plan of 1968, and by the way, the motto of the Southern Strategy was also Make America Great. The only thing you can be surprised about in this election, if you know this history, is the ease at which Trump used it in the 21st century. Trump's attacks on immigrants, Muslims, the LGBT community were merely political ploys based on the fundamental racial fear at the heart of American experience. When he told white Americans in the last 2 weeks of his campaign, this is the last chance, that was a dog whistle. He was saying, this is the last chance. The nation is browning, it's becoming more diverse. By 2020, it's going to be more diverse. By 2030, and surely by 2040. If you do not want another coalition like the one that brought President Obama into office, I'm your last chance. He was touching a psychic wound passed down since the lost cause of the religion of slavery of the 19th century. Nell Irvin Painter, the emeritus professor of American history at Princeton, wrote an article, said, without Obama, there'd be no Trump. She said, as nasty as Donald Trump gets, his poll numbers go up. She said, what's up with that? Why are so many of his followers so mean-spirited? And she says this, here is the iconography of a tragic, traditional American call and response. The call, a challenge to the status quo of white people on top. The response, outbreaks of meanness. that tends to turn white and black and brown people against one another who actually need one another. Yeah. She goes on to say, you have to remember that after President Harry Truman embraced civil rights, Southern Democrats formed their own segregationist states' rights party called the Dixiecrats. Jesse Helms, Strom Thurmond. Then she goes on in that article to say, today's challenge to white people on top is the most acute in history. The election and re-election of a president who's black, with a wife who is black, 2 daughters who are black. She said, and that is why the responses to this challenge began early. On day 1, they vowed to make him a one-term president. On day 1, they sent word down to their allies in state legislatures, block Medicaid expansion. Block anything he tries to do. Don't let people connect their lives, their health care, and their wages with anything this president does, because if you do it, we're going to create a diversity that will forever keep extremism from winning again in the American context. So they continued to refuse to govern. They bought in and fed birthism, stood up on the floor of the United States Congress and said, you lie. Not you are telling a lie. You lie. You are a lie. You. And countless visual stereotypes that had lost currency a century ago. In addition to simply being black, the president had the nerve to embrace immigration reform, a reform identified with brown people. So without Obama, there would be no Trump. If we don't deal with that fact, we are playing a game. Trump is so obviously, she says, unsuited for the job as president, but he is suited to answer the call of restoring the picture of hierarchy that some people embrace. There's another writer, Jamil Bowie, he says, listen, he says this to progressives, it's not just anger over jobs and immigration. You have to know that's part of it, but you have to understand all that is connected to that. He says, for some on the left, Trump is the result of decades of divisive politics, the inevitable outcome of a Republican political strategy that stoked white racial resentment to win election. He said Trump's campaign can best be understood not as an outlier, but as the latest manifestation of the Southern strategy. He then goes on and talks about how the Republican Party has a tradition of harnessing white racial resentment to win election, from the infamous welfare queen rhetoric of Ronald Reagan, who perfected it in 1980, to calling President Obama the food stamp president during the 2012 presidential election. She then goes on to say GOP elites have failed to offer solutions to struggling working class whites who have suffered keenly from the collapse of the industrial economy. And it is true that rapid disorienting economic and cultural change has led to a substantial group of Americans to turn to someone who disdains feckless politicians and pledges to restore the country's strength. But Obama did not herald a post-racial America as much as he brought a racialized America, where many whites were hyper-aware of their racial status. All of which, he says, is to say that we have been missing the most important catalyst in Trump's rise. What caused this fire to burn out of control was Barack Obama. He said, now there have been a lot of conservative writers who have tried to hang Trump's success, and you see it happening now, people trying to rationalize this without understanding the history. They said they're trying to hang Trump's success on the current president, pointing to his punitively extreme position. Obama is extreme. Well, that just ain't true. Obama is pretty much a conventional politician, according to Bowie. As a civil rights leader, I had difference. Many people had difference as a moral leader with some of the positions of President Obama. He is well within, according to this writer, within the so-called center-left. You won't hear me use this language a lot, left and right, because I don't like it. I think it disables us from talking to people. It's too puny, because I'm left and right. I'm conservative and liberal. You know, and I'll explain that later. I see some of y'all kind of shaking your heads at me. Yeah. He says, at least Obama governed kind of on the center-left, that sits safely in the mainstream. Laws like the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, Affordable Care, they weren't impositions from the far left, whatever. They were built out of proposals from the right and left. President Obama is a lot of things, but as many of the extremists say, he is not a radical. But we can't say that for Obama as a political symbol. As a political symbol, he is quite radical. In a nation defined by rigid racial hierarchy, Bowie says his election is a radical event when somebody from one of the nation's lowest caste ascends to the summit of its political landscape. And when you do it with heavy support from Asians and Latinos, and you can cross over and bring in some Republicans and Democrats and gay people and black people and young people, then that election is change. But the kind of change it represents is political inversion. Things are flipped upside down. And when you add that kind of political inversion, and you add to that the decline in incomes and living standards caused by the Great Recession, he says you end up with what Robin DiAngelo, a professor of multicultural education, calls white fragility. And white fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of white stress becomes intolerable. So the Obama era didn't herald a post-racial America as much as it became a racialized America. And the very people that are telling us to accept Trump and be cool didn't do it with Obama. Refused to give him a chance. Did everything they could to undermine. So here's why I read this history. Because I see some of y'all say, I thought he was going to talk about something else. I am talking about something else. There's something else that the media ain't talking about, but if we're going to fight, we need to know it. America, none of us, black or white, can waste time asking ourselves, could this have happened? Oh, Lord, how did the pollsters get it wrong? It happened because it is a habit deep within our public memory. And if we don't own that, we can't repent of it. And if we don't repent of it, we can't come back from the rejection. If we are willing to see ourselves as we are, America, and as we have been, then we understand this is not an anomaly. This is a fight against a third Reconstruction. This is a fight against this room becoming more and more diverse. This is Samuel's time, and God is saying to you, you weren't rejected. Something deeper were rejected, not by the majority, because the popular vote is, this is bigger than Hillary and Obama, and even Bernie. This is America. And America's constant struggle with whether she is going to be reconstructed until finally she becomes the promised more perfect union. So we cannot afford to sit around and blame ourselves. What could you have done more? Why did they reject you? Or even spend all of our time demonizing Mr. Trump, because it ain't just him. Ryan and McConnell may not use the language of Trump, but their policies are just as racist and just as class-based. This never was about tone. Watch this. How many of you all have some colleagues back in your state legislature who shake your hand but then vote against everything you believe in? It was never about tone. How many of you have some colleagues that support race-based initiatives, but they smile? Come on, my good black and white people, legislature, be honest. Oh, now you do understand what racism is. Maybe I'll deal with that later then, maybe. Because that's a problem too, what we understand racism to be. But we don't have to be in despair. Because not only is America this rejection, America has resiliency in her history too. America has, if you read our history, strands of prophetic resistance. I can tell you that for real, because on December the 5th, almost a full month after Election Day, Republican Pat McCrory finally conceded the governor's race in North Carolina. And even as Republicans across the South and the Midwest, or as I like to say, extremists who took over the Republican Party, because my granddaddy was a Republican, Lincoln was a Republican, Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, and they didn't think like this crowd now. But Trumpism swept the South, swept the Midwest. What happened? McCrory was the only incumbent in the country to lose statewide. And this victory for North Carolina shows something about the power of building a moral movement. A moral movement that doesn't just live within the red and the blue. A moral movement that can organize in black communities, but also in communities like Mitchell County that's 99% white, 89% Republican. And anybody committed to resisting the extremism that's coming in the Trump years needs to learn a little bit from us down in North Carolina. You see, when McCrory became governor 4 years ago, I sat down with him to discuss a 14-point moral agenda that had a broad coalition over 200 organizations, and said to him, even as a Republican, if he would do the moral thing, not the Republican thing, not the Democratic thing, but the moral thing, if he would listen to our state constitution, which says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, the enjoyment of the fruit of your own labor, and the pursuit of happiness. If he would just listen to our own state constitution that said beneficent provision to the poor, the orphan, and the unfortunate is the first duty of a civilized state. That's in our constitution. Said if you would do that, we had won the expansion of voting rights fighting Democrats. Moral Monday didn't start, before we get them out when Republicans came in office, it started in 2007 when Democrats went off. We had to fight Democrats 25 years just to get them to expand. Hallelujah, amen, somebody said. I mean, if you're gonna be truthful, you gotta tell the truth. I got some legislators here. There are a couple of Democrats that voted for that crazy budget that just came out of. See, that's why you got to have a moral movement that challenges everybody. Prior to the extremism, every suit we ever brought in North Carolina against redistricting was brought against Democrats or Jessiecrats. Whites who didn't want to share power, who would register as Democrat but did not want to share the full power with black and brown and progressive white people. But when we had this agenda, and we had this guy we called the Little Pope, called Art Pope. He had invested millions in state legislative races in 2010. In order to regain control, they gerrymandered the districts. They cracked and packed and stacked black voters so that black and white voters couldn't build coalitions to elect candidates of their choice. They stacked 51% of black voters into 27 out of 120 House seats, and they stacked 49% of black voters into 19 out of 50 Senate seats. And they secured control of all three branches of the government. They had a complete takeover with a supermajority, not because the majority of the people voted for extremism, because the majority of the people had voted progressive, but the way they had gerrymandered the districts, that majority vote did not create the same result in the Senate, the House, or even in the congressional level. And so they had everything, just like we have in the national level. And McCrory had this broad smile. He wasn't loud and overt like Trump. He had been the mayor of Charlotte. Some people call him the moderate mayor. And he told me in that meeting when we sat down with him on this moral agenda, he said, I'll meet with you once a month if you promise not to criticize this administration in public. He said politics was the art of negotiating deals in private. Some of y'all believe that too, but I'm gonna tell you why you're gonna have to change some of that. But we had already learned what every American must understand in the coming Trump years. Democracy cannot simply be about negotiating deals in private. Democracy depends on everyday people standing together in public and refusing to be divided by those who refuse to serve the common good. You cannot run a public campaign and then govern privately. That's a disservice to the people that elected you. to get elected and then know everything and not even talk to the people that elected you, Democrat or Republican. So McCrory comes into office in 2012 through a backroom deal designed to fracture our moral coalition, confident that black religious voters could be split off from marriage equality advocates. First thing they did was put Amendment 1 on the 2012 primary ballot to define marriage in the state constitution. He based the coalition on fear. He called for the repealing of the Racial Justice Act that said if you could prove that race was used in the application of the death penalty, it should be repealed. He said, no, if you do that, you're going to have these folk, i.e. black folk, coming in your house killing you. And they win a supermajority in 2013. And in the first 50 days, they go extreme crazy. Extremism on steroids. Even though Republican governors like John Kasich had sense enough to expand Medicaid, as Governor McCrory said no to Medicaid expansion, took away earned income tax credit, took away unemployment insurance, cut $1 billion from public education, went after the gay community, went after the immigrant community. And then during Holy Week, the legislature passed Bill 666. Well, the computer called it that. We didn't name it that. It just spewed it out. Now, you all figure that out because the bills come out based on the computer just kicking the numbers out. So it kicked out Senate Bill 666, which had all of the ugly voter suppression stuff. But then they tabled that bill, and then they passed a bill against photo ID in the House because they wanted everybody to call it a photo ID bill when really it was a monster voter suppression bill. And I was there the day that Mickey Michelle tried to stand up, the oldest member of the General Assembly, and read the North Carolina Constitution, and Tom Tillis ruled him out of order for reading the Constitution in a body constituted by the Constitution. And we decided then that if they were going to crucify the sick and crucify the poor and crucify immigrants and crucify public education and crucify the least of these, then every crucifixion needs a witness. So on April 29th, we went in, 17 of us, into the General Assembly to protest. We didn't go in to get arrested. We went in to protest, and they told us we couldn't even protest to hold our signs up in the public space. And they arrested us, but it wasn't me so much. They arrested a woman who had cerebral palsy in a wheelchair. It came out in the paper. And we found out when we did that the people were ready to stand up. And it kept building, and it kept building, and it kept building, and it kept building. Moral Mondays emerged as a direct action of concern. So by the end of it, over 1,000 citizens were arrested. Republicans, Democrats, young, old. We never talked about we were there for Democrat. We were there for the moral reason. We were there questioning policies. Is this policy constitutionally consistent? Is it morally defensible? Is it economically sane? It became the largest civil disobedience in U.S. history at a state capitol. And by the end of the first year, nearly 100,000 people showed up in the dead of winter. 55 to 60% of the folk that got arrested were white. 11% of the folk that did it were Republican. We took our stand in public. We exposed the vulnerability of the divide and conquer tactics. We brought together a cross-racial, interfaith, cross-class fusion, not populist coalition, because populism down south can be a lynch mob. You need a fusion coalition where everybody understands the intersectionality of their issue. They're not just in the coalition until they win their issue. They understand how they all intersect. And in this year's re-election bid, McCrory tried to use then HB2, the so-called bathroom bill. He was going to slip that in there as fear. But then our coalition exposed it, that it wasn't even about bathrooms. The majority of that bill was about blocking cities and municipalities from raising their living wages. The other part was about denying people the right, black, white, heterosexuals even, from filing employment discrimination cases in state court. And we said to our legislators, don't buy into the bathroom piece. Don't even make it a Democratic-Republican issue. Stand up because it's wrong, it's immoral. And that's why our workers stood with preachers and the LGBT community active and the business community challenging this bill as being immoral and unconstitutional. And while all the rest of the country through the South fell to Trumpism, North Carolina, and I believe in large part because we battled for not for one rally, but for 3 straight years. And we battled them in the courts, and we battled them in the streets, and we battled them in the legislative suites. And we lost while we were battling, but we were winning the consciousness of the people. And we were winning victories in the court under the Constitution. And so you heard about, a lot of you, McCory won. Yeah, but let me tell you what really happened. With all of the Trumpism, we still won the AG's office, the Secretary of State, the state auditor, and a black man in a southern state running for the Supreme Court. You know what his margin of victory was? 300,000 votes. And watch this, he won 76 counties out of 100, a black man. That when you have a movement, and part, I believe, of those who didn't have that kind of margin is because there still is a fear sometime of white progressives and Democrats to really hook up racially and connect race and class. Y'all ain't got to say amen. I say it to myself, amen. Because we keep playing the odds. See? There's still, I know in the South, some white Democrats that don't want to fully share power. So they don't want a fully embraced black and brown white coalition. Oh yeah. And so, but when you break through that, you can have massive victories even in the South. Even in the South. And so, why do I say this? And I'm through. I've come together, or I've traveled the country this year, 32 states, doing this revival call for a moral revolution of values. In fact, on December 31st, New Year's night, we're having a big rally here. I hope y'all can come to AME Metropolitan Church if you're in the city. And it's a call for people not to be rejected, but to be resilient. To do like they did in 1862 when they were waiting on the Emancipation Proclamation. They weren't sitting there just waiting. They were saying, 1201, hurry up, come so we can join up. Hurry up, come, hurry up, come. And we need some folk that are saying, we're going to join up, we're going to hook up together. In January 1st, we're not going backwards. We are not of those who shrink back unto destruction. And so if we're going, in my work, I see it as if you change the South, you change the nation. Because if you change the South, you can change some of the Midwest and the Rust Belt. And if you change the South and the Midwest, and the why? Because let me just give you some numbers. Say this with me. Say 171, 31, 26, 13. You got to understand that math if you want to change America. And what that is, that's the math. If you can control the 13 southern states using racial fear and economic fear and religious bigotry, if that's allowed to go on without an authentic challenge, if you control the 13 former Confederate states from North Carolina to Texas, you control 171 electoral votes, which means you only need 99 from the other 37 to win an election. If you control the 13 former Confederate states without a challenge to racial fear and economic anxiety and this heretical form of theology, then you control 31% of the United States House of Representatives, which means you only need 20% from the other 37 states. You control 26 members of the United States Senate, which means you only need 25 from the other 37 states, which means you can lose 12 and still control the majority of the Senate. You control state legislatures and the Senate and the House, which is where you all know the worst and most reactionary bills are being passed. And you control 13 governors who most of the time control state boards of elections. But flip that over. The statistics now say that if you register 30% of the unregistered voters in the South, black voters, and connect that to brown voters and progressive white voters, you can begin to flip states like Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Florida. And if you break through just a little bit in the solid South, this 50-year plan of fear and division, if you break through that, then you begin to break through in America, and if you break through in the South, you change America. And the question is, do we understand this? That people are not fighting a progressive moral agenda because of your weakness. You don't spend $10 billion and pass the worst voter suppression laws and put millions of dollars behind a false brand of religion and play into fear. You do not do that if your adversary is weak. So there's a point that even in the midst of this loss, temporary loss, we must understand that what's really going on is it's a temporary loss because a reconstruction is happening in America. And the truth is, are we going to be rejected or resilient? That's the question of this moment right now. And if we're going to be resilient, here's 14 things we got to do, and I'm through. Number one, we can't believe in helicopter leadership. Ain't nobody going to come from D.C. and save you. You got to have an indigenously led, deeply moral, deeply constitutional, anti-racist, anti-poverty, pro-justice, pro-labor fusion movement from the bottom up. Movement, America changes from Birmingham, Montgomery up. It doesn't change from D.C. down. And we have to have indigenously led leadership, not so-called national leadership that come in, because a sustained moral movement has to begin from the base up. And this movement has to focus on state legislatures. If you're going to change the Congress and change the White House, you got to focus on changing state legislatures and governors across this country. Number two, we have to learn how to use moral language to frame and critique public policy regardless of who's in power. Not just this puny left-right, conservative versus Republican. This is a time when you all must become statesmen and stateswomen. And if you're losing inside the legislature, then start preaching in the public square to your constituency. And start talking to them from our deepest, start letting folk know a budget is a moral document, not a Republican document. Healthcare is a moral issue. Public education is a moral issue. Women's health is a moral issue. Environmental justice is a moral issue. Criminal justice reform is a moral issue. Stopping the proliferation of guns and blocking the vampiric type hold that the NRA has over too much of our politics is a moral issue. Making sure that everybody has equal protection under the law, regardless of their race, their creed, their immigrant status, or their sexuality. Those are moral issues. And we need to reshape our conversation. Number three, you got to demonstrate a commitment to civil disobedience. You all need to have some conferences. What is it that you just not going to take? That you just not going to smile at anymore? That you're not going to just say, well, they wanted to vote? What is it that you will sit down in the middle of the house, of the floor of your house, or the floor of the Senate if they do it? What is it that you will do something so that even if they vote against you, it will have to go out all over the media? Something ain't right. I mean, what is it? When you go back, you know what hope is? Hope has two children, anger and courage. That's what St. Augustine said. Hope got two children, anger and courage. I mean, if folk are dying in your state because of the denial of Medicaid expansion, are you willing to have an act of civil disobedience? Or just maintain the parliamentary procedures? They can't put you out. They can't unelect you. And if they do, go to court and have a big court battle around it. But at some point, you cannot just lose the vote and walk out like it's normal. If this president just cuts and repeals health care, who's going to expose that that's hurting mostly white people? Poor whites. Could this group organize a national sit-in of the legislature the day that Trump repeals it, so that if he does it, it's not done under the cover of darkness, but there's another narrative? Look, if you are progressive, you didn't get the seat that you got by people being nice and accommodating. You got the seat you're in because somebody bled, somebody died, somebody struggled, and you cannot be so tied up in your suit that you don't know how to sit down and engage in an act. If you're going to act okay in this season, then resign and let somebody have the seat that's going to stand up. If your constituencies are hurting, then you ought to be hurting. Henry Thoreau said when he asked one day, somebody, I think it was Emerson, went to him and said, Henry, why are you in jail? Thoreau said, why are you not in jail? And then somebody said, are you going to repent of your acts of civil disobedience? Henry Thoreau said, the only thing I'm going to repent of is not asking what demon possessed me to be so cool and calm and quiet in the midst of so much injustice. It's not what they do. It's what do you do in response to send a signal to your constituency that this is not the time to stand down and that there's another election coming and you want to sharpen their conscience so that by the next time the election comes, they can engage in implementation because you've given them a new imagination. Number 4, you got to build a stage to lift the voices of everyday people. The day if somebody repeals health care or denies living wages, you should be organizing members of your constituency and bringing them to the legislature and putting them on camera so that the world has to see. We got to recognize the centrality of race. Somebody asks you, is it class or is it race? You got to say both. You should never have any agenda that's going to try to be an economic agenda without race. That's playing in America. That's trying to skirt around. It's race and economics. Somebody asks you, is it race or class? You say, it is. It is. And you got to be, if you're committed to the long-term work of economic injustice, you got to be committed to the work of racial injustice. Because racism and progressive, don't let these folk get you all hooked calling about David Dukes and a Klan march in your state. Those things are deplorable. Racism is policy. Racism isn't even tone. You can be a nice racist. There's a book at Duke talking about racism without racists. People never will use the ugly word, but you have to disaggregate the impact of the policy. And then you have to show the innocent, like voting rights. Voting rights is an attack on black people, but voting rights is an attack on women. It's an attack on health care. It's an attack on living wages. Because if you suppress the vote, you can't elect progressive candidates. And if you don't elect progressive candidates, you can't have a progressive public policy. And we need white people to speak out against racism. Policy racism. Not Donald Trump. Not David Dukes. Not policy. And expose, and then help folks show people, particularly men of our white brothers and sisters in the South, you voting for somebody that tells you they're against living wages and against the minimum wage increase and against health care. You think it's hurting black and brown people, and it's actually hurting you. Number 6, we got to build a diverse coalition of religious leaders. Number 7, we have to intentionally diversify the movement with the goal of building unlikely allies. I'm telling you, if you start this moral movement, you can build some allies. One of the few places, if the only place in the country a few years ago where incumbent Tea Party is lost was in North Carolina, out in western North Carolina, where black and white people learned how to come together around a moral agenda in the mountains of North Carolina. And one of the reasons Trumpism did not take over North Carolina, because they expected him to get 80 and 85% of the vote in the West. We went out there with the Moral Monday movement and organized. And while he got 60% and 65% of the vote in some of those western counties, he didn't get the 80. Number 8, we got to build long-term relationships. Not elections that we have an election and then after the election is over, all the infrastructure goes and we just go back to no. Long-term relationship. Then we've got to make a serious commitment. Every legislator in here, you got to figure out a way to have you an academic and an empirical analysis and somebody connected to you, because you can't read all that stuff. You got to find a way, because the worst thing you can do is be loud and wrong. And the worst thing you can do is like some people in North Carolina who voted for the House HB2 talking about, I didn't read it. Well, that's why you got to ask somebody to help you. If you're part-time, you got to build a coalition of scholars around you, because that can help you articulate moral positions, strong, empirically sound. Then we've got to utilize social media, all of it, every bit of it, to get the word out. And then the last thing we've got to do is we have to engage in voter registration and protection and education. Don't forget, people talking about why Trump won and all this. You know the thing they're not talking about? That there were 800 fewer sites for black people to vote in 2016. 158 of them were in North Carolina. 43% of the 381 counties, in a study that was done by the Leadership Conference of Civil Rights, had 165 less voting locations, and those are the places where if the Voting Rights Act Section 5 was in place, they would have had to pre-clear before doing that. Now, you in this body, if you are not signing off on a major call to reinstore the Voting Rights Act, you're not serious even about economic justice. Because the fact that the Congress, the most racial thing this Congress done, the most race-based thing they have done, that is also the most damage to economic justice, is the refusal to fix the Voting Rights Act for over 3 years, because Strom Thurmond only engaged in a filibuster for 24 hours in 1957. Ryan, McConnell, and Boehner have engaged in a filibuster for over 3 years, over 1,200 days. That is more racist than anything Trump has ever said. Because when you undermine voting rights, you undermine the heart of our democracy. And this body, if you're serious, one of the major calls you have to make, black and white together, is a call for the full restoration of Section 5 of the Voting Rights. Otherwise, those states that are covered, your legislature, the majorities can pass anything. And even if you lose it, even if the Congress doesn't do it, you do not want history to be written and it doesn't say you called for it. And you demanded it. And then lastly, you got to pursue a strong legal strategy. You got to get some lawyers that will get some of that progressive language in the Constitution in court. Where are my legislators from North Carolina? All right, I'm going to give you a lawsuit. You got to figure out how to do it. You got to introduce a bill calling for a living wage, a vote on the living wage, and you got to base it on the clause of the Constitution that says everybody has a right to the fruit of their labor. It's in the Constitution. Now, if you're not making a living wage, you don't have no, it doesn't say the right to the fruit, it said the right to the enjoyment. So if you don't have a living wage, you can't enjoy the fruit of your labor. And every legislator in here ought to reread your state constitution and go find those clauses that have never been tested, especially in the South, because a lot of the Southern legislators never fully rewrote those Reconstruction Constitution. So our foreparents slipped some things in there. I didn't know the Article 11 of the state constitution, Section 4, said that beneficent provision to the poor and the unfortunate is the first duty of a civilized state. I didn't know that was in there till we started the Moral Monday movement, and we decided we had to read the Bible and the Constitution. You need to read it. Every legislator here needs to carry it with you with all the progressive line. And even if they outvote you, it needs to be on the record. And sometimes you got to find a group of lawyers that are willing to take your bills to court and test this stuff under the state constitution. The victory we won against voter suppression included the 14th Amendment, but also Article 6 of the state constitution. There's power. There's power. And then lastly, you've got to have an attitude that we're not a one rally kind of people. We need a movement mentality. So where are we? We're in a difficult moment, my brother. I've been too long, but we're in a difficult moment, And we've seen the ugly side of America, but there's another side, because that's not all we are. We're not just reaction. We're not just racism. We are also the heirs of great dissenters who have stood for right even when they were a minority of one. We are the heirs of Justice Harlan from Kentucky, who was the lone Supreme Court justice that stood up in 1875. And he laid the legal groundwork for Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall. We are the legacy of Thurgood Marshall, who got Jews and white lawyers to go in and battle Plessy versus Ferguson. We are the legacy of W.B.E. Du Bois and Ida Wells and some of the ancestors of Lincoln and Garrison, who took on Woodrow Wilson when he played Birth of a Nation and put alt-wrong in the Oval Office in 1915. This stuff isn't the first time. We are the descendants of Viola Woosa from Michigan, a Unitarianist, a white woman who gave her life fighting for voting rights. We are the heirs of James Reeb, a white man. We are the heirs of Fannie Lou Hamer, who was beat down but got up and said, I'm still going to let this little light of mine shine. We are the heirs of Swanner, Cheney, and Goodman, who died, and the students that followed them, they didn't run from Mississippi, they ran back to Mississippi, even in Alabama, even after people were killed, because they knew that in every age there must be an army of resistance, no matter how much the powers that be gloat. And so after Tuesday's rejection a few weeks ago, which is America as apple pie, now you must apply the moral defibrillator to your own heart. You must say, wake up, heart, and be determined to stand for love and justice more than ever. Let me clarify that election as a preacher. First of all, we elected a mortal and not a God. I wish I had a witness here. We didn't elect a God, nor did we elect a king. And the second thing, after November the 8th, you were not unelected. The Constitution was not unelected. Your faith was not unelected. Your hope was not unelected. And your power to stand up was not unelected. And if we come together across all these lines and build an anti-racist, anti-poverty, pro-justice, moral coalition, and we understand what they used to say in South Africa when it got real bad, they would look at one another and say, you know, only a dying mule kicks the hardest. In other words, some of this stuff we're seeing is the dying of extremism. It understands that a new future is coming. It understands that diversity is coming. So if you believe in voting rights on Monday before Tuesday, you ought to still be fighting for voting rights now. If you believed in health care before the election, you ought to be fighting for health care now. If you believed in public education before the election, you ought to be fighting for public education now. If you believed in women's rights and LGBT rights before the election, then you ought to still be standing after the election. Nothing has changed. You better warn those who gloat. Pride cometh before the fall. Don't you choose hate, because hate is too puny. Choose love. Choose justice. Tell our children, don't be what you've seen. Don't be a bully. Don't be a racist. Stand up for what's right, because you are our now and our future. If you're alive, you better thank God for waking you up this morning and starting you on your way. If you've got strength in your body, you ought to say, well, I must be here to fight. Believe that we are those who never sound retreat. Believe that people fought worse than what we're facing today. Yesterday, they couldn't have been in a room like this. Yesterday, they would have been lynched. Yesterday, they could have been shot. We are the heirs of those who fought with less and they won more. Let us with more fight and win some more. It ain't over till God says it's over. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. I don't intend to give up until America is America again. As Langston Hughes said, America may have never been America to me, but I swear this oath that America will be one nation under God, indivisible, 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 with liberty and justice for all. Get up from your rejection. It's time to be revived.